the Moscow Economic Forum, and an even greater honor to do so in the company of such distinguished speakers. So, in the last few years, it became commonplace to say that the international system is undergoing its most disruptive and transformative period in decades, maybe in a century. It's a process that's been pushed forward by a series of juxtaposed and mutually reinforcing crises, but also by structural forces arising from a changing geopolitical dynamics, with the appearance of new centers of power and a major process of rebalancing in the international system. Now, what does that mean? It has been argued that what this major rebalancing means is that, on the one hand, the international system is becoming less centered on the Western Bloc and is being increasingly shaped by the relationship among great powers, China, the US, Russia, and on the other hand, by a greater role played by important non-Western countries from the global South. Now, in this process, it can be observed that the degree of dependency by the members of the Western Bloc on the United States has also sharply increased, economically, militarily, technologically. Even in the case of Europe, it seems clear that the level of strategic autonomy has been significantly reduced. Since the beginning of the new US administration, just over a year ago, these processes and global trends have been further accelerated, going into a sort of overdrive. And so, in addition to all the unilateral economic coercion measures that we have seen in this several past years, there was a global tariff war waged by the United States, which brought nothing but supply chain disruption and inflation. In reaction to the comment by Mr. Timofeyev in the particular case of Brazil, and he is right when he says that the reasons behind the imposition of tariffs against our country by the United States had less to do with economic logic and more to do with political interests that impinged upon our own domestic politics. And so after negotiations with the American side and with the participation of the private sector of both countries, they realized that, for example, 50% of the orange juice consumed in the United States comes from Brazil, 30% of the coffee as well, and about 30% of all regional flights operated inside the US are flown by Embraer aircraft, which is produced in association between a number of companies of both countries. So all these things came into play, and fortunately for us, economic logic prevailed. But, you know, the further, in this context, since the beginning of the US administration, there has been further fracturing and weakening of international regimes with disengagement from various international organizations, disregard for international law, the normalization and even the promotion of the use of force to achieve national interests, including control of energy resources and the creation of spheres of influence. All we have to do is to remind the National Security Strategy document that was published last December. And there has been talk about the so-called Down Road Doctrine, of which the kidnapping of a sitting president in Venezuela is the most egregious example so far. And of course, there has been a further increase in the number of conflicts worldwide. More recently, as we know, the war, or I should say, the brutal and unprovoked war initiated by the United States and Israel against Iran has plunged the global economy in its biggest ever oil and gas supply crisis. It has also deeply affected fertilizer trade and therefore food security worldwide. So this conference takes place in the not very uplifting scenario of escalating geopolitical tensions and the virtual disintegration of the international order. Not the rules-based international order, please. A term that we reject, by the way, since it reflects the selective approach of some countries to international law. I can't help but remember a quote from the Italian Marxist political philosopher Antonio Gramsci, when he said that the old order is dying, but the new one struggles to be born. The problem, as we know, is that in the meantime, the potential for crisis and disruption becomes extremely high. There are indeed those who believe we could be very close to a global confrontation. There are also those who, on a more optimistic note, believe that this war against Iran could become a turning point in the transformation of the international system towards further multipolarity. So what is the way forward? In our view, the way forward is clearly the reform of the system in order to adapt the current institutions and norms to the new multipolar reality that is taking shape. This has become more urgent than ever, in our view. The alternative will be further disruption, instability, and conflict, with consequences that are hard to contemplate. We believe that multipolarity needs to be underpinned by a renewed multilateralism, which is anchored in international law and in the primacy of the United Nations. A reformed United Nations, to be sure, with greater representation of countries from the Global South in its main bodies. The same applies to economic and financial institutions, such as the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. Brazil's participation in BRICS is a central element of this approach. The G20 is another important vehicle, even though we recognize its problems, particularly now under the US chairship. We think that BRICS is well placed to contribute in a constructive and consistent manner to the reform of the international system. It's a platform for political and economic cooperation integrated by an important group of countries with an agenda centered on the reform of global governance as well as on the promotion of the shared growth and sustainable development. And in that regard, it can also play an important role as a vehicle of the Global South. I mean, the BRICS can play this role as being a vehicle or a representation of the interests of the Global South within the G20. Thank you very much.